So the common grounds are very, very clear that if they believe that Allah is one and Muhammad is his prophet and the conveyor of his message, then he is a Muslim, whatever the difference in details. And every difference in details is justified. Everybody has his own argument, and Allah will judge among them in the last day, in the day of judgment, on the day of judgment. And whatever the differences, the other differences, they can be tolerated. They can be discussed together in a peaceful way and in a civilized way. And this is what happened through all times, through all centuries. They were Sunnis living with Shias in every place. I think we began to have this sensitivity when we had lack of education and we had lack of knowing Islam itself. Well, the human beings who read the Quran and the Sunnah and understand them and interpret them are human beings influenced by their own socio-cultural environment. This proves that the human thinking is very important in interacting with the words of God. The words of God are the same, but understanding them and interpreting them and elaborating on them and making details and analogy according to them, of course, differentiate from time to time. So I think that in our time, after we passed the atomic age to the space age now, and we have the internet and we have many mass communications means, the situation would be different. We can grasp more cultures, more thoughts, and all this would influence us in understanding the endless wisdom of the divine words.
The Quran and the translations of the Quran are useful and should be used. Of course, if you cannot speak in Arabic or read Arabic, it's a good way to get a sense of the meaning, and it's good, and it should not be dismissed as, it's not the Quran. In order to understand the content, to understand the meaning, it's really good. But I really think that now in the European countries, in the West, it's much more accepted. In fact, it was accepted first with English, because, you have Muslim majority countries that are speaking English, for example, Pakistan, Indonesia, and others. So it's accepted now, and in UK, in other English-speaking countries. I think it's becoming a reality in other European languages, for example, Dutch and German, and the people now are getting this. Now there is something which is different when you are going to pray. In fact, you are praying and saying the passages of the Quran in Arabic. So this is why you should learn by heart some excerpts and some surahs and chapters of the Quran in Arabic. And I think that this is also something which is a good thing, because it gives you a better relationship with the language, and helps you to understand that you need maybe to get more Arabic knowledge in order to get the Quran and to get the meaning and to be autonomous, because it's really important to try to be autonomous in your relationship with the book. So it's two different things. Is the way you pray, it's in Arabic. The way you understand the Quran could be done through all the other languages, knowing that it's not really the Quran, but it's already an interpretation, but because to translate it's to interpret.
Actually, the people should deal with the Quran and with the authentic tradition of the Prophet. As far as the cultural heritage, they may derive from it, but it should not be the basic deciding factor, because the culture actually change with the time, it change with the different places and so on, but the basic concepts are the same. But on the whole, as I said, Islam is quite capable of adapting in the matter or in the area where a change is possible.
About the interpretations we have within Islam, there is something which is really important. There is a consensus of the scriptural sources. The Quran is the first one, and the prophetic traditions are the second set of scriptural sources. So here you have something which is, okay, the Muslims agree on that. They agree on a second thing, which is, as to the fundamentals of religion, there is no disagreement. So the fundamentals are the oneness of God, Tawheed, the credo, al-aqidah, the 6 pillars of the credo, and then the practice, the 5 pillars of the practice, Islam per se. So on these 3 main things, there is no disagreement. There is an acceptance, and this is why we can say Islam is one, because if you go to Indonesia, and from Indonesia to Morocco, from Sweden to Spain, all the Muslims are dealing with the 3 fields exactly the same. The oneness of God, the credo, and the practice are all, this is one Islam. Now, we have the 2 sources, and then we have interpretations. So we have different schools of interpretation and different trends. And in fact, I'm used to say to the Western audience, it's not only the moderate and the fundamentalists or the extremists. It's more complex and subtle than that. Because you have, Muslims dealing with the source in a literalist way. So they are literalists. You have Muslims following a very specific school of law. They are traditionalists. They are following a specific tradition. You have people and Muslims following something which is a more mystical approach. They are Sufi. You have people dealing with a more rational approach towards the text. They are rationalists. You have people saying, yes, we have to deal with the text, but you have also to take into context to take into account the context. They are reformists. And you have people reading the source only from a political viewpoint. They are, literalists sometimes with a political approach. So it's not 1, 2, or 3, it's 6, 7 sometimes, different trends. So if you ask yourself who is the right, I think you cannot answer there is only one which is right, as long as these trends are not undermining the 3 main fields of the fundamentals, so the credo, the aqidah, all this, they are within something which is an accepted diversity in Islam. So any single community everywhere in Utrecht or in UK, in London, every single community at the local level, you will find these trends. You have different people, and literalists, and more reformists, more open-minded, more, narrow reading of the source. So what a Muslim should do, is it to say, okay, they are all the same, they are all accepted, yes, but you have to ask yourself, why do you stand yourself? And it's also a personal choice. You may find yourself feeling good, where something which is a very traditionalist reading, say, okay, I'm following a very specific school of law. Or literalist, when it's written black, it's black. Or more reformist, I am much more, in tune with the whole reformist tradition. This is my tradition. And I am dealing with people from other trends. It's not always easy, but we need this intra-community dialoguing among ourselves in order at least to be to agree on the fundamentals and on some issues at the local level or at the international level. And then we have to deal with this diversity. The problem is that you have to manage to deal with it in a way which is not to standardize or to try to have a uniform understanding. It's not going to happen. But a better way to deal with this diversity, and sometimes we need platforms where the Muslim leaders can just meet and accept their divergences. This is something which is really important. It's lacking today. We are dealing with something I call a crisis of authority within the Islamic communities and the Islamic world. This is for sure the case. Now, for any average Muslim, my advice would be to say, look for your own trend, and then from within this follow something which is much more in tune with your own psychological and your own expectations. But at the end of the day, it's a personal choice. At the end of the day, when you have a diversity, it cannot just be imposed onto you. So some can, and sometimes we are even changing. Some, when they are, they are young teenagers, they feel that they are very strongly close to the literal, and very black and white reading, and then they evolve and they are dealing with their own life, and then it becomes more reformist because they are themselves changing. So we can be within our own life. Sometimes we are following three different, tendencies. At the end, you become more mystical and trying to find something. It can be, but it can be as long as you are respecting the fundamentals. You say the testimony that you believe that there is one God and that the Prophet is his messenger. Then, if within the three main fields that I mentioned, then it's up to you to find your way.
If there is difference, and this is normal among human beings, they can discuss these differences, and some opinion may prevail in the end. But we should not be scared by any difference in interpreting the word of God or in anything related to the religion. Because religion is, some people think that because it is the word of God and the revelation of God, it is like the mathematical tables, 5 by 6 make 30, and it should be like this. No, if it is language and words and deals with human issues, then there should be different perspectives and different points of view. And if they discuss the matter together, they can reach something, or at least every point of view would be clarified.
If there's one thing that the Quran has talked about, perhaps more than any other of the Semitic traditions, is the recognition that there are other ways of believing in God, namely by mentioning Judaism and Christianity. And although there are all sorts of variations on how the Quran looks at the Jewish people and how the Quran looks at the Christians, it's recognized that these are communities that the Quran recognizes as not only believing communities, but also as people who will be saved. So from that very basic theological premise, how does one translate that into sociological reality? Does one even need that theological premise? Well, if you argue that you do need it, well, there's also a humanitarian premise there as well, which is that we are all part of the same world. And how does one coexist with people of different cultures and different beliefs? We cannot talk about God's mercy and compassion in the Quran as if somehow that has nothing to do and should not be reflected in human mercy and compassion and human respect. Unless we continue to endeavor to try and translate divine compassion and divine mercy and the kind of pluralism that is very much part of the Quranic worldview, then that will not only be detrimental to the way Muslims see themselves, but perhaps more importantly for Muslims, the way other faiths see Muslims. That this is an inclusivist, enclosed, entrenched religion that cannot talk about pluralism in the Quran because it doesn't practice it in reality. And so just from that very theological basis, it's an absolute imperative that Muslims see that other people have other ways of finding God, and that the emphasis on respect and understanding and allowing people to express themselves, not through inter but also intra-faith diversity, is very much part of God's plan.
The real issue here, it seems to me, is the way we approach the Quran and the way we approach what we see as Islamic law or Islamic rules, regulations, and so on. It is very important, I think, for Muslims, not just Muslims living in Europe or in other countries where they are minority, but Muslims everywhere, to approach the Quran and Islam from the perspective of the underlying values and principles, rather than merely latching themselves to a literal interpretation of the Quran. Now, if you look at Islam merely from a literal perspective, you would come to all sorts of conclusions which do not make sense in the modern world. But if you look at it in terms of underlying values and principles, then I think you would come to certain positions which would make a lot of sense in the 21st century. Let me give you a couple of examples to support this. Now, the question of a schoolgirl covering her face. Now, is this something that is ordained in the Quran? It's not. It is not stated anywhere in the Quran that women should go around covering their faces. There is a certain notion of modesty in the Quran, not just for women, but also for men. It's supposed to be modest. Now, modesty is an underlying principle. What is important is that underlying principle. And that modesty is not just in terms of one's attire. It is something that is expressed through one's behavior. That is even more important than one's attire. Now, if you see it from that point of view, issues such as the hijab and covering the face and so on take on a different meaning. You would emphasize the underlying values rather than merely highlighting the form. So this is the debate between form and substance. It is important for Muslims to emphasize the substance of their religion rather than the forms. And I would say this for many other areas where issues such as equality between the sexes and so on have emerged. The Quranic spirit, perhaps even more than the Quranic spirit, even the letter of the law in the Quran emphasizes equality between the sexes. That's very, very clear. The question is how one expresses that equality in the present day world. Now, for a lot of Muslims, certain things are unchangeable. The male and female are equal, but Muslims will not support premarital sex or extramarital sex. They would argue for the sanctity of marriage and the sanctity of the family. They would define marriage as a relationship between man and woman, but that doesn't mean that one should deny homosexuals or people with a different sexual orientation the rights which are theirs as human beings, meaning by which a homosexual has a right to work, to be educated, to participate in society. The very fact that Islam, right through its history, has never condemned a homosexual because of his or her sexual orientation, when it comes to religious practices, that should be an eye-opener for all of us, meaning by which a homosexual has a right to pray, a homosexual has a right to fast, and that fast has the same value as the fast of a heterosexual. A homosexual has the right to perform the Hajj. The homosexual has the right to do all these things, which means that even in areas connected with religion, which is at the heart of Islam, the homosexual is not discriminated against. But if you look at the institution of marriage, now marriage has a different meaning because human beings were created of a pair, and that is supposed to be the nature of man and woman from a divine perspective. So that is something that Muslims would want to preserve. But that is a position that a lot of people in the West also take, that marriage is marriage, but at the same time you recognize the rights of homosexuals and so on. Now what I'm saying is, I think there's a tremendous need for Muslims to think and reflect on the underlying principles and values of their religion. The problem with a lot of Muslims is that they don't think and reflect about their religion. It is just blind emotion which drives them most of the time.